Hello lovelies. This is going to be a long and rambling rant because it's kind of hard to tackle this subject in any other way than in a long and rambling rant. I'm probably going to miss things. That will be an oversight on my part. It won't be malicious, and I can't possibly hope to counter every single talking point and piece of malicious disinformation pumped out by the Kremlin in one video. But if there's something particularly important you think that I've missed, please politely ask me about it in the comments. So, Ukraine, formerly the Ukraine, to describe it as an area of the Russian Empire or the USSR, Ukraine has been independent from Russia since 1991. This was confirmed by a referendum in December of that year, which had over 90% support. This all as part of the breakup of the former Soviet Union. In 1994, Ukraine relinquished its nuclear arsenal, in exchange for which the US, the UK, and Russia provided assurances to Ukraine that its sovereignty and borders would be respected. This was a memorandum, an agreement, a handshake deal. It wasn't a treaty, unfortunately, but it does nonetheless have impact on the word and trustworthiness of the signatories. In this agreement, Russia, the US, and the UK all agreed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and existing borders. They promised to refrain from threatening or using force against Ukraine. They promised to avoid economic coercion to influence Ukraine's policies. They said they would seek immediate action from the UN Secretary Council if Ukraine were to be threatened or attacked with nuclear weapons. And they all promised not to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine unless Ukraine attacked them first in alliance with another nuclear-armed state. Now, this is all the agreements that we made, the US, the UK, and Russia. I think we can see that both Russia and the United States have failed to respect pretty much any of those. Now, Russia obviously breached several of these over the years, and the USA has since. As I say, this was not a binding treaty per se, but the credibility of the various signatories was very much at stake, and only the UK has really kept to that, which, god damn you, you've made me patriotic about the United Kingdom 3 times in 1 week. In 2004, in November of that year, Ukraine underwent what was called the Orange Revolution. These were mass protests which erupted after allegations of fraud were made regarding the apparent election of a Russian puppet, Viktor Yanukovych, not Weird Al Yankovic. The election was invalidated in Ukraine's courts after investigation, and a more secure second vote was held in which a more pro-Western candidate won, Viktor Yushchenko. Yes, they were both called Viktor. Maybe that's responsible for some of the confusion. But there was very strong evidence of Russian interference in the 2004 election, including political support, financial support, disinformation, and potentially even direct involvement in election manipulation, which in the context of later goings-on involving Russia seems pretty goddamn likely. Russia openly backed the pro-Russian candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, against pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko. Russian President Vladimir Putin personally endorsed Yanukovych and even visited Ukraine twice before the election. And think about the flack Obama got for merely saying some positive things about the UK remaining in the EU, and this seems pretty egregious. Russian state media, much of which could be picked up in Ukraine, heavily promoted Yanukovych and discredited or attempted to discredit Yushchenko. Election fraud favouring Yanukovych was uncovered at various stages in the process. So the original election results declared Yanukovych the winner, but international observers, including the OSCE, reported that there was, in fact, widespread voter fraud. This isn't like the claims made in the US. This was actually observed, recorded. There was evidence of it. The fraud included ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, and all the media bias favouring Yanukovych. After mass protests, since named the Orange Revolution, Ukraine's Supreme Court ordered a revote, which Yushchenko won. There were other problems with Yushchenko. He was poisoned that year, which left him partially disfigured. Some reports and investigations suggest Russian involvement, but there's been no definitive proof directly linking Moscow, but they're kind of known for this shit. So it's not a huge leap to think that they might be involved. Russian advisors and spin doctors worked very closely with Yanukovych's campaign, including Gleb Pavlovsky, a Kremlin-linked political strategist. Russian state media spread disinfo against Yushchenko, portraying him as a US puppet, which is kind of ironic, really. Russia funded Yanukovych's campaign, though we don't know exactly how much by. There were leaked communications and intelligence reports from Western intelligence and Ukrainian officials, which confirmed Russian involvement in election manipulation efforts. Similar tactics, disinformation, election meddling, and cyber operations have later been observed in Russia's interference in Western elections, such as in the 2016 US election. And yes, investigations in the West and elsewhere all confirmed that Russia was interfering in the 2016 US election and in the Brexit vote in the UK. What they did not prove was direct collusion with the Trump campaign. However, there was massive Russian interference and disruption in favour of Trump. This is a long-standing tactic of theirs. In 2013 and 2014, from November to February, there was a second sort of revolution in Ukraine, and this was called the Revolution of Dignity. Protests began after President Yanukovych, yes, he was later more legitimately elected, rejected an EU association agreement in favour of closer ties with Russia, who obviously had been interfering in Ukraine for some time, and whom most Ukrainians, if not Yanukovych, were tired. This escalated into violent clashes. Over 100 protesters, called the Heavenly 100, were eventually killed. Yanukovych, in a move rather confirming his guilt and collusion, fled to Russia for shelter in February of 2014. Ukraine then established a new pro-Western government, seeking further ties with the EU and the West in general. Then, in February 2014, strange how this happened so soon after, Russia annexed Crimea with the thin justification of an unrecognised referendum with no legitimacy. From there, they moved on to beginning to screw with specifically the Donbass region, attempting to nibble away the edges of Ukraine. They funded and supported, sometimes directly with troops, Russian separatists, ethnic Russian separatists, in Donetsk and Luhansk. A ceasefire was eventually brokered in 2015, but violations of that kept on occurring as time went on. Zelensky was elected in 2019 on the promise of resolving the Donbass situation and eliminating corruption in the Ukrainian government, which of course largely stemmed from Russian interference. By all accounts, he was doing a pretty good job on the corruption count, whatever the far-right US media has to say about the Bidens and their involvement in Ukraine. Zelensky, when he came in, began firing corrupt officials, dismissing judges and prosecutors who'd been accused of corruption. There were efforts to reform the judicial system as a whole and clean up their courts, but they faced resistance, particularly from oligarchs and pro-Russian factions within the government. Many anti-corruption laws already existed, others were added, but they were not being fully enforced because the judiciary, the legal system, was already so corrupt. Anti-oligarch laws were brought in, but again they had limited impact due to the level of corruption in favour of Russia, meaning it was very hard to enforce a lot of these things. The anti-oligarch law was passed in 2021, and this law restricted oligarchs from influencing politics, media and government. Critics say it's only been selectively enforced and that it's politically motivated rather than a true crackdown, but the real problem is probably simply that oligarchs have so much money and power, it's hard to rein them in, even when the whole government is behind it. And there are still ongoing issues with corruption which undermine efforts to remove Russian corruption within politics and society. Amid the war in 2023, Zelensky did fire several top defense officials over procurement corruption, which is a problem that is endemic in a lot of former Soviet countries and within Russia itself. Basically, generals and people in charge of procurement pocket the money, either never buy the gear or buy substandard gear or don't keep it up and just pocket the cash. This is a large part of the reason why Russia's offensive stalled and failed, corruption within their military. However, being under attack, defense sector reform became a priority due to the large amounts of Western aid and the scrutiny that came with it to Ukraine. In response, Ukraine strengthened the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. So it's kind of ironic that America's far right accuses Ukraine of corruption when, in response to exactly the kind of things they're complaining about, Ukraine further strengthened its anti-corruption measures. And in this instance, at least, the results of that can be seen on the front lines, in that Ukraine has managed to effectively defend itself with modern gear, with lots of gear, shells, everything else that they need, and Russia is apparently still suffering from massive internal corruption. A new chief of the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office was appointed in 2022 after years of political stalling and interference. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau has prosecuted corrupt officials, but cases move pretty slowly in Ukraine's courts, and again there are still problems because the Russian corruption and interference is so utterly endemic. The judicial system is still regarded as pretty corrupt. Judges often block reforms or protect elites on a selective basis. Some critics say that anti-corruption efforts target political rivals more than allies, but given the interference of Russia and everything else that has been going on in Ukraine, I mean, this isn't exactly surprising. If all the corruption is coming from one source, then enforcement is necessarily going to target that source more than any others. War has shifted the focus, obviously, of what's been going on, so outside the procurement and military processes, Zelensky's attention has been on defense, not reform, but by and large, Ukrainians seem to have swung behind that, though not necessarily everyone in the judiciary or politically. So the war started because throughout 2021, Russia began building up troops on the border of Ukraine. No one seems to have really believed that they were going to invade, apart from Ukraine itself and a few others, and a lot of intelligence analysts who were ignored to one extent or another. But they did invade, and here we all are now. So why did this happen? Some people blame what they call NATO expansionism, but nations have to ask to join NATO, and it is a long and agonizing process. Has Ukraine asked to join NATO? Yes, at various times, going all the way back to 1994. It has been blocked or stalled at various stages due to fears of Russian aggression and fears of provoking Russia, which is now obviously no reason at all for NATO not to expand, and every reason why Ukraine should be admitted to NATO. The idea that any peace agreement has to necessarily exclude NATO membership is ludicrous. Of course, with Trump undermining NATO, membership of NATO might not mean much going forward into the future, but nonetheless, this is something that we should consider extending to them. And it's not surprising that they went for NATO membership if we look at what Russia has been up to for a great many years, and if you're a next door neighbour to Russia and used to be part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, then being part of some sort of defensive alliance seems like a pretty fucking good idea about now. I mean, this isn't the first time that Russia has gotten up to this shit. In 2008, there was the Russo-Georgian War. Georgia, under pro-Western president, noticing a trend, Mikhail Saakashvili, I apologise for mangling all these Russian names, Russian-type names. So he sought NATO membership. Again, sound familiar? Tensions escalated over the breakaway regions of southern Ossetia and Abkhazia, which had pro-Russian separatist movements in them, and this formed the pretext for Russia to invade Georgia. In August, Georgia launched an attack against its separatists to regain control over southern Ossetia. And then the next day, Russia chose to invade Georgia, citing the need to protect southern Ossetians. Russian troops pushed deep into Georgia, seizing Gori and Poti. And yeah, this is Ukraine on a smaller scale and with less success resisting. Russia ended up recognizing southern Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states, and then set up military bases there. So, yeah, basically it's now stolen large chunks of Georgia's territory, and they're now puppet regimes. So Georgia lost control over both regions permanently. It's just too small a country to resist, however brave and valiant its defenders may have been. There are other examples. Moldova, for example. The Transnistria conflict has been ongoing since about 1992. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Moldova's pro-Russian Transnistria region declared independence, and there's been shit going on there ever since. Moldovan and Transnistrian people began to fight there, and the Transnistrians were again backed by Russian troops. Russia eventually sent in the 14th Army and effectively secured Transnistria's control. Russia still has troops in Transnistria despite Moldovan protests, and Transnistria operates as a pro-Russian breakaway state and another puppet with heavy Russian influence. So yet again we see the pattern here. Kazakhstan. In 2022, Russian peacekeeping, heavy use of scare quotes there, have been involved there for some time. Protests erupted in Kazakhstan over fuel prices and government corruption. Then Russia, under the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, kind of successor to the Warsaw Pact, sent troops to help suppress protests. This was seen as an effort to keep Kazakhstan in Russia's sphere of influence, which it was. The intervention here was short-lived, but it did demonstrate Russia's ability and willingness to intervene in post-Soviet states to keep them on side. There are common patterns in all this behaviour. Of course, Russia has chosen to intervene in former Soviet states that look towards the EU or towards NATO, or even just look towards the West, thinking, you know, we can get some security, money, better state of life, and so on by forging stronger links with the West. And Russia apparently cannot have that. They tend to back separatist movements in order to create expensive, draining conflicts in these nations. They use unmarked troops and hybrid warfare to avoid direct blame for their interference. They claim to protect Russian-speaking populations as justification for their interference, and then once they're in, they establish long-term military presences in occupied territories. This hybrid warfare has extended into NATO countries with assassinations, sabotage, economic disruption, active interference in elections, media, divisive nonsense, abuse of social media, interference in referenda, elections, and more. Their involvement in the US elections in 2016 is well documented. It's just that nothing has been done about it, and even their interference has been misrepresented. The election of Trump the first time, the backing of supposedly independent media groups, Likely the election of Trump the second time, interference in the Brexit referendum, and the division and rise and funding of the far right all across the world. Much of this can be heaped at Russia's door, and they're very good at it. They've been very good at it since the years of the Great Game in the 19th century. They've had special success within the EU, stoking the far right, and particularly in Hungary and Croatia, which is why they're siding with Russia and trying to undermine EU action to compensate for the withdrawal of US action, which is perhaps their greatest success as of yet. People describe Trump as a Russian asset, which implies that he's an asset in that he's someone they've groomed and put into that position. I don't think that is entirely true, but he is certainly a Russian asset in the sense that his decisions, his randomness, and so on have certainly helped Russia over anyone else. So he's an asset in that sense. Russia has ambitions, not dissimilar to those of Hitler last century. They want to restore their glory years and the full extent of the old USSR or the old Russian Empire. It also, on a more pragmatic and less ideological basis, has eyes on the resources of its neighbours. So this is both an ideological and a pragmatic decision on the part of Russia to try and rebuild itself and reclaim its past glory. I think also part of it is Putin wanting to cement a legacy for himself. Ukraine has successfully, more or less, resisted Russian propaganda and hybrid warfare, and has steadfastly refused to become a client state in the way that someone like Belarus has. Yes, Ukraine sought NATO membership defensively, as have others. It was once part of the Greater Russia, and it has enormous reserves of natural gas and produces a shit ton of grain, vital to global food supplies, but especially those in the global south, where Russia also has geopolitical ambitions. The rare earths and other stuff, that's a little more questionable as to whether they even have them, because the reports were made by Soviet-era geologists who were under enormous pressure to say more was there than there might necessarily have actually been there. So it's questionable whether those resources are even there. But all of these reasons are why Ukraine is a target, and that's why this is the closest thing to a just war that we've had this century. There have been shameful attempts by the USA to extort Ukraine in exchange for weak or even non-existent guarantees of safety and security, when, given past form, Ukraine has no reason whatsoever to expect that even these weak guarantees will be honoured, thanks to the Budapest Memorandum. Endless money from the US and others goes to Israel in its aggressive war of expansion, and seemingly America is now a fan of authoritarian dictatorships around the world and perhaps seeks to become one itself. Certainly Trump's political moves would seem to bear that out. Ukraine is a litmus test for our morality and our resolve as Western civilization. And yet, ironically, as many of the people who say they want to save the West, who are most against our involvement in a just war in Ukraine, but are for our involvement in a now unjust war in and around Israel, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. And here in the UK, this hybrid warfare has come to us in more direct fashion. I went to college in Salisbury. Salisbury was the site of one of Russia's assassination attempts on a dissident who was sheltering in the United Kingdom. They made the dissident and his daughter very, very ill, and they killed and sickened civilians. Yeah, it's not distant. here. It's not something that's happened elsewhere. And anyone who remembers their history lessons about the 1930s and the preamble to World War II sees shockingly similar things happening in and around Russia. And we also learned from our history lessons that appeasement and capitulation does nothing to stop these people expanding, pushing their luck, taking more and more territory, taking until something snaps, and then it's a much harder fight. And that's not what we want. So yeah, support for Ukraine is a moral and civilizational test, and one that the USA is currently failing hard. This is a democracy that wants closer links with the West, that is crying out for us to honour our agreements, and if we fail to defend a free democracy against an authoritarian dictator, if we just let this go on, what is the point of us? What is the point of our ideals? We may not always live up to them, but it seems to me that we should at least try. And if Ukraine can stand up to Russian propaganda, hybrid warfare, and now direct warfare, we should be able to too. Zang.
The priest, he says we're wicked, for to worship the devil's bird. But we respect the old ways, and we disregard his word. For we know they rest uneasy as we slumber in the night, and we'll always leave out a little bit of meat for the bird that's black and white. One's for sorrow, two's for joy.